Thanks very much, Chair. Have we got anybody at the table who can tell us about the government's bid for a spot on the Human Rights Council?
Senator Ludlam, I'll invite my colleague Lachlan Strawn, who is the division responsible for Australia's Human Rights Council candidacy, to come to the table.
All set?
Yep.
Okay, let's just start with something broad. How does the government rate its chances of securing a spot in October?
Lachlan Strawn, First Assistant Secretary, Multilateral Policy Division. We're in frankly, a fairly tough race. We're running for one of two seats against France and Spain in the WEOG group. France and Spain are both formidable competitors. They have very large diplomatic networks. So I would say at this point, we've been running a rigorous professional campaign, and we would feel that we have a chance of winning and a chance of losing.
Make it sound like a sporting event.
And Senator, I would say that we are naturally very focused on winning, and that all of our efforts are being directed to that end.
Okay, that's good to hear. So in lobbying for votes then, have any other countries raised concerns about Australia's human rights record, particularly in relation to our treatment of refugees?
I would say, Senator, that in our discussions about requesting support for our human rights candidacy, that has not been the case.
So our diplomatic representatives who are tasked with lobbying haven't reported any instances of concerns raised about our refugee policy. Do you want to take that on notice and just check the record?
No, in more general discussions, yes, that has happened, but in the precise discussions about our candidacy and requests for support, I'm not aware of any country directly raising those concerns.
Okay.
But I can check.
Yes, maybe. It would be fascinating if nobody had sought to raise it in the... I understand the distinction you mean between the general conversations that diplomats are engaged in all the time. Has anybody, maybe if you're checking the record, has anybody had concerns raised with them about our weak opposition to human rights abuses in places like Sri Lanka or West Papua or elsewhere?
Could I say, firstly, Senator, our approach to Sri Lanka has not been weak. We have maintained a very consistent and strong position on Sri Lanka. What I would again say is that in the direct discussions about our human rights candidacies, countries have not raised that particular issue with us, as far as I'm aware.
In terms of our strong record on human rights, are we still lending them military equipment and white vans to the police agency that is alleged to have committed really horrific human rights abuses, or has that practice stopped?
I will ask my colleague from our South Asia division to pick up that question.
I wasn't intending on going there right now, but let's, since we're there. No, please come forward.
Kathy Klugman, First Assistant Secretary, South and West Asia Division that covers Sri Lanka. Yes, Senator? Sorry,
I put a question to your colleague just before.
Yes, I think would you repeat the question for me?
In maybe the estimates before last, so maybe last May or thereabouts, I raised some concerns, or might even have been before that actually, about Australian support and military or paramilitary equipment, vehicles, white vans, naval patrol boats. But the stuff that I was particularly interested in was that Australia appeared to be supporting, I think it's called the CID. Does that ring a bell?
Senator, the CID is the Criminal Investigation Division. It's part of the Sri Lanka Police.
Yeah, so you'd no doubt be aware of open source reporting that the CID has been engaged in alleged to have engaged in disappearances, torture, extrajudicial killing, and all manner of other really horrific human rights abuses. These are allegations, but no doubt you're aware of them.
Yes, Senator, you're aware those are allegations that go back some time.
Right. So what have you done to validate them, and are we still supplying that unit with equipment and training and so on?
My understanding is that there's no current supply of such equipment to any units, including the CID, of the Sri Lankan Police, but that would be a matter for the Australian Federal Police to respond to in detail. On our collaboration more broadly with Sri Lankan government, Sri Lankan security services and their human rights practices, we do have a strong, as Dr. Strawn said, an ongoing conversation and engagement with the Sri Lankan government on human rights practices. We make very clear in very direct ways our support for international standards and for improvements specifically in Sri Lanka. You'd be aware, I think, Senator Ludlam, that there was a change, a very significant change of government in Sri Lanka, first at the beginning of 2015 with the election of a new president, and then subsequently with a new government established later that year. That government has made clear its commitment to improving human rights practices across the board and pursuing deeper reconciliation in a post-war context in Sri Lanka.
Okay. Thanks for your evidence this morning. I'm making sure I pronounce your name correctly. Is it Strahan?
Strawn.
Strawn. Beg your pardon.
Like the town in Tasmania.
Which I've never had the pleasure of visiting. Has, just coming back to our HRC bid, have any countries made any comments, particularly in Latin America, the Caribbean or African countries, regarding our aid cuts following our successful Security Council bid in late 2012? Obviously that was a bid that was put together by the previous government. But I suspect there's a certain amount of cynicism in that we ramped our aid budget up, got the votes that we needed and then bailed on them a couple of years later. Has that particular issue come to light so far in the lobbying that's going on?
Yes, it has been a topic of conversation, but I could say, for instance, in Africa, we have in fact recently funded a number of projects, including with the African Union Commission.
Oh, so we're starting it up again now, we need their votes again?
No, we've had a continuing program in Africa which had to be wound back when the cuts were made to the aid program. So naturally you would expect in the conversation we have with countries that they would express their opinions about this topic, but I can't say that it has soured these conversations about our request for support.
Might be a bit...
just on that, Senator, if I can add, I think in terms of the change of focus of the program, that's very clearly part of the government's policy to focus on the Indo-Pacific region of the program. That's where Australia is seen as the lead. In terms of our focus in Africa, we still have a very strong NGO program that operates there, as well as scholarships and volunteers as well. So it's, and we also have a number of global programs that provide humanitarian support into Africa and provide support elsewhere, including in the Middle East and the Caribbean. So yes, the focus of the program's changed, but our efforts across global humanitarian efforts and our focus in Africa has been narrowed, but we're still providing support into that region.
Well, I recognise it's not the fault of any of the officers at this table that the aid budget was cut, and I get that it had to come from somewhere. But maybe I should just be blunt and ask what it is that I'm thinking. Do we target our aid contributions to countries when we're seeking their votes for places on councils like the HRC or in the past the Security Council? In this particular instance, do we target our aid budget to countries in a quid pro quo type manner? Is there anything behind the scenes that would indicate that we do that?
No, Senator, our approach to the allocation of the aid budget is consistent with the government's policy.
Well, the government's policy is to seek a bid on the HRC.
No, aid policy, right? The aid policy is very clear around the objective of the program is around economic growth and poverty reduction with a focus on the Indo-Pacific region. So that's how we determine each year, and that budget allocation is determined by the Foreign Minister each year. And if you look at our allocation this year, it's quite similar to other years in terms of that focus. So no, from my point of view, there's no quid pro quos, if you like. There's certainly exchanges of support for other countries in terms of other things they may wish to stand for, but the aid program's not used in that way. No.
It's not used as a bargaining chip as such?
No.
Okay. Is the government planning, and Senator Brandis, you might want to take this, I guess this is straying into policy, planning on reconsidering its aid budget? We heard this morning that our aid budget, I think in response to questions by Senator Wong, that our aid budget is projected to decrease even further, I think to 0.21% of GNI by financial year 1920. Is there any consideration of maybe reconsidering that in the light of what seems like an imminent decision by the Trump administration to significantly cut its aid program?
Well, thank you very much. Well, Senator, in the December MyEFO, we announced some changes to the aid budget. $100 million over 5 years from 2016-17 was allocated to establish a regional health security partnership fund to tackle emerging health security risks in the Indo-Pacific region. $5.4 million over 5 years from 2016-17.
Sorry, Senator Brandis, you might have misunderstood. I can check MyEFO for that. I recognise those commitments were made. I'm talking about the overall allocation into the forward estimates.
Well, all I can tell you, Senator, as I'm advised, is that overseas development assistance is forecast to increase in 2017-18 in line with the Consumer Price Index.
Not as a proportion of GNI.
May I finish, please, without being interrupted? As announced at MyEFO in 2014-15, as you would expect, Senator, the final figure will be determined as part of the 2017-18 budget process, and I'm sure you wouldn't be expecting me in March to be announcing decisions that will be announced in the budget.
It's not disputed, Senator Brandis, that as a proportion of GNI, the aid budget declines over the forward estimate.
I'm just trying to respond to Senator Ludlam's question as I understood it.
The government doesn't dispute that. That's what your figures say.
I hadn't heard any time in the past benchmarking our global aid budget against CPI, so that did catch me a little bit unawares. But the reason that I'm asking this, obviously, is since MyEFO came out, the incoming administration has made some fairly severe proposals around cuts to aid. And
you're talking about the Trump administration?
Yes, I am. Sorry,
yes.
Not here domestically. And I was wondering whether that maybe sparks any kind of response from Australia. So particularly what I'm interested in is whether...
Well, I think it's wrong to think, Senator, that we benchmark or make decisions about our overseas development assistance budget by reference to what other countries do.
In my experience, that happens all the time. It happened in Myanmar. We work collaboratively with other countries all over the world.
I think you're talking about the global budget, aren't you?
Yes, I am. Well, let me put a specific question to you. I understand the point that you're making. Will Australia make any new pledges of financial support for sexual and reproductive health to organisations impacted by the global gag rule to help fill that gap? So this doesn't go to the overall quantum of aid, but here's a program which is immensely valuable, which Australia has been a part of supporting before. After President Trump cancelled US funding to these incredibly valuable support services for women, for example, the Dutch government stepped up and said, well, we will help fill that gap. Is that something the Australian government could consider?
Well, look, as I said, we don't make our decisions by reference to the decisions of other countries. I'm not aware of what the Dutch government may have done, but Mr McDonald, I think, has some detailed information for you, Senator.
Great.
Senator, in terms of the program you mentioned, that program's been in place since 2007, and what was announced recently was the third phase of that program, which provides another $9.5 million over the next 3 years, with a focus on our region, which goes to what I talked about earlier in terms of the focus of the program. In terms of the decision-making around that, we entered into those arrangements in December of this year, and therefore that program is a continuing program. Also, in relation to the proposed or speculated aid reductions, there's no detail on what that is coming out of the administration at this point. There is a Mexico agreement that's been put in place or signed by the President. But beyond that, the extent of that is not yet known.
I'm getting the wind up from the chair, so I'll just put this one on notice, if you may, whether you could pass back to your minister whether Australia will consider stepping up to fill the gap as the Dutch government has done if the US administration follows through on its commitment to zero out its contribution. So I don't expect an answer right here at the table. But
in relation to just to define the particular program that you're concerned about, Senator?
It's Well, in the US, it's spoken of as the global gag rule, that anybody who's providing abortion services to women, they will no longer fund, or family planning services to women, they will no longer fund. I'll provide some information on what the Dutch government's undertaking was, if that'd be helpful.
Well, so you want to know, in the event that the Trump administration were to reduce
They've already announced it.
They've announced it.
They've announced that they're zeroing their
in the
assistance.
event that the Trump administration were to reduce its assistance in relation to reproductive health, in those countries where Australia provides aid for similar programs, whether Australia's contribution would increase correspondingly.
That's a reasonable summary, Senator. Yep.
Thank you. Thanks, Senator Ludlam. Senator